wanted to continue from the discussion that we had last time on dedication and goals and finding your passion and all this kind of stuff, and sort of extrapolate on another idea contained within it. And it's something that I've been thinking a lot about through weightlifting, through book study, jiu-jitsu, all this different stuff. And that is the concept that sometimes too much information can be the biggest distraction that we have when we are attempting to chase down our goals. I remember when I was a kid, before the internet and all that stuff, well, not before it, but certainly before I had access to it, anytime you asked my mom a question, you'd say, hey, what does this word mean or whatever, she would always say, look it up. And in order to look it up, you had to use an encyclopedia or a dictionary or whatever. That seemed like a great deal of information at the time. Now, of course, we have access to basically unlimited data, limitless amounts of information at any time and at any moment, because we have these magical devices in our pockets that we can look up everything from the surface temperature of the sun to another sweep from closed guard and jiu-jitsu to some new fad diet or whatever all the time. And this access to this creates almost this information addiction within us that can often lead to having a very tenuous grasp on what we were talking about before, which is choosing this road and sticking with it and sort of running it to its end. So what I mean by this is that, for example, in jiu-jitsu, I know that I would rather roll against someone who is maybe like a shitty blue belt. This is coming from a guy with only like a year and change of experience, so take with a grain of salt. But I would rather roll with a blue belt who tries to use a bunch of crazy techniques because he's tried to learn as many of the crazy things as he can and is throwing spider guard at me and all this stuff, but he's doing it not very well. I would rather roll with that guy than I would with, say, a one-year white belt who has basically taken his entire time to make his guard very difficult to pass, to have a really good pass himself, and to make his positional control very tight. That's a much more difficult opponent because he's focused on the basics and he hasn't inundated himself with what I would consider to be too much information all at one time. With weightlifting, you can see these guys who are sort of always lily padding on, what their program is, what their diet is, what they're hoping to achieve. So you'll see these guys get really strong or add a lot of weight or something like that to their lifts over a 6-month period or a 3-month period, and then they change what they're doing, which seems crazy. I think it was maybe Jim Wendler who said something like, if you start to build a wall out of brick and you're putting the mortar on and you're slapping the bricks up there, and then you see the wall about halfway built, do you switch the way that you build? No, you just keep building the wall, right? So with diet, you see the same thing, and even in sort of like, to get weird with it, in like the occult world, you always see people switching traditions. They kind of discover one thing and they read it for 5 or 6 months or even less, even book to book, and then they go to this next thing and this next thing and this next thing. So the guys who they have no staying power and they have no real depth of knowledge on any one thing. So the question there is, how far are you going to advance along this road that you're talking about if you won't stick with a strategy, a technique? So a little bit about what I want to talk about here today is the idea that last time we talked about finding this passion and just driving towards it. Well, that's all well and good, but like we've talked about in other videos, every goal that you build, you're building this castle up in the sky and you have to create these steps in order to get there. So too much information, too much access to data creates 8 million steps, and none of them lead necessarily in one staircase. There are all these other steps, and some of them are lateral ones. So by overloading yourself with information and by doing yourself the disservice of kind of always being receptive to 8 million different things at one time, you are actually limiting your ability to progress with focus toward that goal. So to my friends out there, what I want to say is, and we've talked about this with this month's challenge where we're discussing the idea of programming your reading. Instead of just reading every book that comes along, make sure it fits into the curricula that you've built for yourself. But with everything else, we have to do the same thing. If you are practicing martial arts, don't feel that you have to be at home trying to absorb 8 million pieces of information. Just take the basics that you're working on and get really good at those before you start trying to add anything on top. If you're lifting weights, stick with the program. Get any program by any good lifter and stick with it for like 6 months to a year before you start talking about changing it or jumping to the next thing or switching up what you want to do. Because if you're lifting weights and you're trying to get stronger, you're going to be deadlifting, you're going to be squatting, you're going to be pressing, you're going to be benching. That's a pretty basic amount of movements with a finite amount of stuff and ways that they can be programmed. So just pick one and stick with it. The same goes for diet. The same goes for reading. Don't get sidetracked by too much information. I'll paraphrase Robert Greene here from, I think it's his book, Mastery. And he talks about the idea that what makes somebody masterful, what makes someone incredibly productive, is their ability to take an idea and to follow it from start to finish without being distracted by all this media that's constantly surrounding them. And that can be anything, guys. So this month, when you're working on your meditation and the rest of your practices, what I want you to do is really start looking at all the things that you're doing and all these goals that you have and asking yourself, do you have a consonant plan for all of those things? Do you have step A, B, C, D, and so on? Or have you changed that a lot? Having solidity and steadfastness in your goals, I find, creates solidity and steadfastness in character. So this is just something to think about this month. 92.
Ars caldo ganga ya de guna sin ersida na